Viewer's log, stardate 306747.4, April 22nd, 2016. The ship is on patrol by the Romulan neutral zone. Report, Mr. Mike Sena.
It's Professor, and this is really stupid.
You're out of uniform. I could reprimand you for insubordination.
Listen, I put the badge on the lab coat. That's the best you're going to get. Also, you don't need a complicated segue to talk about Star Trek. You've already talked about Star Trek 1,000,000 times, and you didn't need any segues then. You don't need one now.
Really? Okay, then. Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair.
Don't do the Shatner voice.
Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. I love Star Trek. Duh. While The Next Generation is my favorite of the franchise, I also love the silliness and cheap sets and effects of the original Star Trek. And this year is the 50th anniversary of the original series. Yes, 50 years this September, the world was introduced to Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Scotty, Uhura, Sulu, and Chekhov. Well, technically not Chekhov since he wasn't a part of the cast until season 2, but still, the original Star Trek paved the way for TV to be able to tackle real issues by placing them in the far future. From it, we got the Klingons, Romulans, and Khan! Without it, we wouldn't have a Next Generation, so it's time to really show some love to where it all started. And since we've already done a top list of my favorite episodes of the Next Generation, let's do the same for the original series. These are my top 15 episodes of Star Trek, the original series. Yesteryear. This one is a bit of a cop-out. Technically, this is from the animated series, but I'm including it for a reason. With as far-reaching as Star Trek was, and still is, there were a lot of non-TV and movie Trek stuff. Comics, books, video games, so there had to be a line in the sand for what's canonical and what isn't. While the rule is a little fluid now, for years it was established that the only things that were canon were the live-action TV series and the movies. So that leaves out the animated series. Sort of. There is one episode that everyone, and I mean everyone, including Gene Roddenberry, the man who decreed that only things that he agreed with were canon, is canon. And that's this episode, and seeing as how I'm never doing a top 15 animated series episodes list, I want to talk about it here. The episode is amazing, and the only reason it's number 15 is because of the fact that it's not technically from TOS. The basic plot is that during a trip in the Guardian of Forever, Spock is suddenly erased from history and replaced, with no one except Kirk, who was with him in the Guardian, remembering his existence. Learning that he had died as a child on Vulcan, and Spock goes back into the Guardian to discover that, in an attempt to prove himself a capable Vulcan despite his human half, he went on a survival test prematurely and was killed, despite Spock remembering that he was saved by a cousin of his that he only met that one time. They learn that that cousin was Spock, and because Spock had not yet saved himself, it was undone, and so Spock has to go through to his own past and save himself. It's a brilliant episode. Not only does it use the Guardian of Forever in a unique way, it also does something that could never have been done on the original series due to restrictions of technology and budget. Plus, it was written by D.C. Fontana, who was responsible for a lot of Spock's backstory. Yesteryear, one of the best episodes of a show it technically wasn't a part of. 14, Where No Man Has Gone Before. This was the second pilot for Star Trek after The Cage, which NBC rejected. NBC did, however, decide to give Roddenberry another chance to produce a pilot, which gave us William Shatner as Captain Kirk. As much as I am intrigued by The Cage, I have to concede this is a stronger pilot. The sets are better, the acting is marginally better, much improved by Shatner's performance and Nimoy's subsequent removal of Spock's emotions, done because he's played Spock slightly emotional with Jeffrey Hunter's Pike, as Pike was very stoic, and so they needed a little emotion from Spock to balance it, but with Shatner, who gives off emotion already, he could be more reserved, which was for the better. The episode is just okay, but I really like it. I like Gary Mitchell as a villain because he was just a guy who was imbued with absolute godlike powers, and as they say, was corrupted absolutely. We also get our first Kirk ripping his shirt scene. The episode also has what I thought was the best part of the first episode of Scrubs, which is completely nailing down the personalities of both Kirk and Spock, with everyone else's coming later. The story is a little lacking, but it's a serviceable episode, and hey, it has Gary Lockwood and Sally Kellerman from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Robert Altman's MASH respectively, so maybe that's why I like it. 13, All Our Yesterdays. The actual finale of the original series, Turnabout Intruder, is not a good episode. I much prefer to think of this as the finale. Not that it wraps anything up, it's just a better episode, and by stardate takes place after Turnabout Intruder. And maybe I'm a little biased because it includes guest appearances by Johnny Hamer and Mariette Hartley, who played Sergeant Zelmo Zale and Inga in MASH. But the episode has the strange new worlds, an interesting story, and time travel, which instantly elevates it for me. But, like a lot of Season 3 episodes, it's not very good. The story is interesting, but all of these Sarpedians are assholes, and while I understand their plight, Atos is too evasive when answering questions, and Spock's relationship with Zarabath is weird. It just sorta comes out of nowhere when Spock wouldn't even reciprocate Nurse Chapel's feelings. Plus, while the Ice Age was interesting, Kirk's trip to the Sarpedian version of 17th century England was really out of place. It's something I'd expect more from an episode of classic Doctor Who rather than an episode of Star Trek. An alien world that gives so much to explore, and we get 17th century England. Don't get me wrong, it's a good episode, all qualms aside. I just wasn't impressed by where Kirk went. Other than that, I really like the episode. 12, Courtmartial. I love episodes that go into the backstory of characters, and this one gives us some backstory on Kirk. See, unlike the J.J. Abrams movie, the real Captain Kirk earned his title through years of work and not because Nero killed all of the other captains. Kirk previously served on the USS Farragut, and before that, the USS Republic, with the Enterprise's current records officer, Ben Finney. Kirk and Finney were friends, and Finney even named his daughter Jamie after Kirk. Then, during an inspection, the young Ensign Kirk discovered that Finney hadn't noticed a circuit open that, had it been open longer, would have destroyed the ship. That pushed Finney to the bottom of the promotions list, and he had to spend the next decade watching Kirk rise through the ranks, while he would likely never get his own ship, because Kirk reported it when he technically didn't have to. The episode deals with Finney, now crazy with anger at Kirk, using an ion storm to fake his own death and get Kirk court-martialed for it as revenge, while Kirk and Spock try to clear Kirk's name and find Finney. The episode is very gripping, as despite the fact that we know Kirk is innocent, I couldn't help but be on the edge of my seat as the trial commenced and Kirk was being convicted. The ending is satisfying, and there's a lot of stuff in this episode that makes it great, and I really don't want to spoil it because this is an episode that I think everyone should watch. 11. Balance of Terror. This episode marked the first appearance of the Romulans, and the first appearance of Mark Lenard, who would later go on to play Spock's father Sarek in one episode of TOS, one of the animated series, 3 movies, and 2 episodes of The Next Generation. I like the episode, and it's probably just because of this one line.
Well, here's one thing you can be sure of, mister. Leave any bigotry in your quarters. There's no room for it on the bridge.
Although, considering the Romulan commander looks like Spock's dad, I guess Styles wasn't that far off about Spock possibly knowing how to translate Romulan. But still, the episode introduced Romulans and cloaking devices, and the story is good, even if it is technically an adaptation of The Enemy Below, with the Enterprise as the destroyer and the Romulan bird of prey as the submarine. The episode is good, the story is great, and even if it's a bittersweet ending, it's a good episode to introduce one of the biggest foes to the Federation. 10. Patterns of Force. The Nazi episode. I like this episode because it's an interesting concept. A history professor from Earth travels to a primitive culture and turns it into Third Reich Germany. The story is as expected, but it is interesting in that in the end, it wasn't the history professor doing all of the killing and rounding up stuff. It was his deputy who drugged him and took control of the operation. I also really like how they work with the Resistance and help fix the world, and it's a world I would have liked to see revisited in The Next Generation, because considering how Earth got past the Nazi stuff, I'd want to see how that world developed after the Resistance was able to stop the space Nazis. The episode is good, and despite focusing on a serious matter, still has comedy, like Kirk and Spock trying to pass as Nazis, and hiding Spock's ears, and their seeming indifference to being beaten in the prison. Spock I expected it from, since logic and suppression of emotion is Vulcan nature, but Kirk doesn't even flinch. 9. The Naked Time. This is a great comedic episode, a rare example of Trek really nailing comedy and drama at the same time. The episode is about the entire crew getting exposed to an inhibition-stopping contagion that makes them all go nuts. Riley takes over engineering and sings an Irish ballad non-stop to the annoyance of the crew. Sulu runs around shirtless with a fencing sword, believing himself to be a musketeer. Chapel decides to declare her love for Spock. Spock loses control of his emotions, and when they finally do get Riley out of engineering, they learn he shut the engines down and have to figure out a cure before they get destroyed by a disintegrating planet. The episode is great. It's really worth it because of all the fun everyone seems to be having playing their normal characters without inhibitions, and I think Leonard Nimoy and George Takei probably did the best job, and Nimoy's performance as Spock when he goes crazy is probably the best of everyone's performances. 8. The Doomsday Machine. The Planet Killer is one of the scariest adversaries that the Federation has ever faced. And despite its inclusion in inferior material, the weapon is scary. I mean, that thing is basically unstoppable. It took out a Constitution-class starship and at least one entire solar system. It's one of the scariest Star Trek villains, and it doesn't even have to talk. And it's a gripping episode between Kirk and Scotty being trapped on the dying constellation, and Commodore Decker going progressively more insane out of the guilt he has for letting his crew die. There's a lot of compelling story going on. While I wish they had taught us more about its origins in the episode, it's the mystery around the Planet Killer, where it came from, who built it, that really makes it an effective villain. 7. Journey to Babel. Spock is my favorite character, so any episode with his backstory is going to be a favorite of mine. And this one is a great example of his background. We learn about his relationship with his parents, especially with his father Sarek. Meeting Sarek and Amanda for the first time is cool, and it's the first time we really get to see what made Spock the way he is. Plus, the mystery is interesting with the Andorian saboteur. Plus, we get our first looks at the Andorians and the Tellarites, who would later have a much bigger part in Enterprise. Though, I think the best part is the ending scene, where both Spock and Kirk are forced into hospital beds, and McCoy finally gets the last word. 6. Amok Time. The fight music. That really is the best part of the episode, but the entire episode is great. It's the first episode to really introduce backstory for Vulcan, and even gave us the Vulcan salute, which Nimoy based on the priestly blessing in the Jewish religion. And it also gave us live long and prosper. So it's responsible for introducing that to the masses as well. Plus, we got the absolute best closing to an episode ever, even beating out Journey of Babel with McCoy getting the last word. I'll let it speak for itself.
Just one thing, Mr. Spock. You can't tell me that when you first saw Jim alive that you weren't on the verge of giving us an emotional scene that would have brought the house down.
Merely my quite logical relief that Starfleet had not lost the highly proficient captain.
Yes, Mr. Spock, I understand.
Thank you, Captain.
Of course, Mr. Spock. Your reaction was quite logical.
Thank you, Doctor.
In a pig's eye.
Plus, out of every Star Trek melee weapon, the Lurpa has got to be my favorite, even more so than the Batleth. Enterprise, one to beam up. I'm sorry, Captain. I'm giving her all she's got, but the transporters aren't working. We'll be right back. And we're back. The Trouble with Tribbles. Another great comedy written by David Gerrold, who we've already talked about on the show before. He's the guy who wrote the story in which Golden Age of Hollywood actors are military men dropping a nuke on Germany from Alternate Warriors. The jokes are funny, all of the characters manage the comedy, and it introduced one of the most interesting of the creatures that the Enterprise would encounter, aside from the Mugato and the Alpha 117 canine. Plus, that scene in the bar where Scotty gets into a fight, not because the Klingons insulted Captain Kirk, but because they insulted the Enterprise, is hilarious. And the subsequent scene where none of the security officers sell each other out is cool as well. Plus, what other episode has William Shatner getting pelted by purring hairballs? Overall, it's a good episode with a good ending and funny characters, especially Cyrano Jones and Arn Darvin. Though I'm sure that guy will never cause Starfleet trouble again. 4. The Menagerie. The Cage is a bit of a clunky episode. It's a little too stilted, none of the actors are quite right, and it's a little confused as to whether it wants to be an action show or a think piece. I like it, but I prefer this episode more. The Menagerie uses the footage from The Cage in a new way. Since the events of that episode, Captain Pike was promoted to fleet captain, and during a training mission with a bunch of cadets, he saved them but received a massive dose of Delta radiation, leaving him confined to a wheelchair on Starbase 11. Spock, with the help of the Telosians, the big-headed aliens from The Cage, who wanted Pike to mate with Vina to create a race of slaves, plans to take Pike to Talos so their illusions can allow Pike to live as a normal person for the remainder of his life, and not as an invalid who can only answer with beeps. Despite the implication that they might still do that slave race thing, the episode is good. There is a mystery, and if you've never seen The Cage, this is the better way of experiencing it, since the framing really helps enhance it. Spock defying Starfleet and Kirk to save his former captain? It's a compelling story, and the twists and turns are awesome, showing us the loyalty that Spock has for Pike, and foreshadowing the loyalty that Spock will have for Kirk in several events in the later incarnations of Star Trek. 3. Space Seed. This is the episode that introduced Khan Noonien Singh. That's all I have to say about it. This episode made the second and best Star Trek movie possible, so it's gotta be up on the list. It's only number 3 because I like the next 2 a little bit more. Khan is a great adversary, and while he doesn't become the most formidable foe they had ever faced until Star Trek II, it's a good start. Learning about the eugenics war of the 1990s, you guys remember that? I mean, I was just a kid, but that was a weird part of our history, right? Learning about Trek's version of history is always fun. But yeah, the episode is interesting, as even though we didn't have a giant genetic engineering movement with warlords, genetic engineering has become quite a thing since the episode, so it was kinda prophetic. Though, genetically modified vegetables are much different than genetically modified people. Ricardo Montalban is a great actor, and even here does a great job as Khan, although he can't outdo his performance in Star Trek II. 2. Mirror, Mirror. This episode is amazing. Not only did it show us the first glimpse of another reality in Star Trek, we also got the cliché of alternate versions of characters having goatees. Yeah, every evil double that has a beard, that was popularized by Star Trek. The episode has action and compelling ideas. An entire universe where Starfleet is evil, which was of course revisited on multiple occasions, mostly in Deep Space Nine and once on Enterprise, and in Shatner's crazy novels. Seriously, those things are insane. Kirk is turned into a Borg. It's awesome. You should check them out. Anyway, yeah, the episode is great. Spock's double is the best of all, because as a logical being, he's a neutral party in both universes. Plus, the uniforms are great. One of my favorite things about the Terran Empire is their logo and the uniforms. They just fit so well. Spock's is probably my favorite, but I am a sucker for vests, so Kirk's I also like. Though, if I wore that, I'd probably put a shirt under it, cause where else am I gonna put the bow tie? The Mirror Universe has always been one of my favorite parts of Star Trek lore, and this, the episode that started it all, is one of the best episodes of the series. 1. The City on the Edge of Forever. I think this is a lot of people's number 1 episode, and for good reason. The episode is both time travel and an interesting moral episode. If you don't already know, Kirk and Spock travel backwards in time to the 1930s to prevent McCoy from altering the timeline, causing the Enterprise to not exist. And in doing so, Kirk becomes romantically involved with a social worker named Edith Keeler, who is supposed to die in a traffic accident, but when McCoy saves her, she prevents America from getting involved with World War II, and Hitler and the Nazis take over the world. Kirk's moral quandary is knowing that she is supposed to die in order for his world to exist, and dealing with him having to let a woman he loves die to set time back on its rightful track. It's a great episode and a very good example of how to do a good time travel story, because the episode makes you wanna like Edith Keeler, and you're in the same camp as Kirk. You don't want her to die, but on the flip side, you want the Enterprise and Starfleet to exist. It's actually kind of similar to the needs of the many philosophy from Star Trek II. In order to save millions, the many, Kirk must let Edith, the one, die. This is an episode definitely deserving of the number 1 spot. And those were my top 15 Star Trek The Original Series episodes. Did you agree with them? Are there episodes you were surprised to see there, or any you were shocked to see omitted? I just want to remind you that these are just my personal favorites, and are not a definitive must-watch list for TOS, even though I'm certain that it overlaps with several of those must-watch lists at certain points. These are just the episodes that I enjoyed when I first saw them, and like to go back and watch when I'm feeling Trekkie. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the Literary Lair, you can hit that subscribe button. And if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. See you next time. So, Mike Santa, what did you think of my list?
I found your choices fascinating. I found your choices highly illogical.